Right. So thanks so much for that. Yeah, Honorable Prime Minister, be here.
I prefer my POI in the chat, please, but I'll probably ask her one. Preferably, or wait, actually, I'll ask her one. Forgot this is not BP. Give me 1 second. 3, 2, start. Note that a lot of these nations are post-colonial and they've been controlled by an outside power. For example, the British occupation of India, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Therefore, oftentimes these benevolent strongman leaders are post-colonial leaders. For example, they help the country overthrow colonial power, and they're often seen as important political figures and national heroes. Therefore, there is a power asymmetry that exists. That looks like Gandhi in India, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore have implemented a lot of important policies that have lasted until this day. Therefore, moving on to further contextualization and the stance and the counterfactual, and I'll forward two arguments. Firstly, on their political legacies influence policies making for a significant period of time, and secondly, on the trade-off versus unity, which is preemption to the side opposition. I think firstly, then just moving forward on the contextualization, right? Why this debate is instead in Asia is they tend to have an overemphasis on the contribution of these post-colonial leaders versus elsewhere, right? What that looks like is, for example, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam and Mao Zedong in China have mostly leaders that are literally dedicated to them, and a long legacy that are dedicated to them within your history textbook, right? Versus George Washington in the US, where there is now more of an open dialogue recently on his owning of slaves and problematic behavior, and where President's Day is no longer celebrated. This also looks like Asia set in Asia because there's oftentimes multi-ethnic backgrounds, and these leaders are from specific backgrounds, which are oftentimes not of the majority. The glorification then looks like is an overemphasis on the contribution of these leaders to society and what they've done. They help the country, yes, but these individuals are not perfect. They're not godlike. The stance that we're forwarding today is that this glorification has done more harm than good and halted the progress of Asia. The counterfactual then, what that looks like on side government, is that this House regrets counter-narrative will allow for more social discourse surrounding these strongmen leaders and allow for more constructive policies and political discourse. It means that they may still have some influence, but ability to dissent, critique their policies is easier than just some pieces of preemption before moving on to the government case. Opposition will probably tell us that they have contributed positive to the country. We're not actually debating that, right? However, it is glorification that opposition has to defend today. They need to defend why there is likely to be discourse, because there is overall a lack of discourse under the status quo right now. What does this glorification look like? It looks like exaggerating their benefit and saying it is worth the trade-off, and oftentimes emotionally close to you. For example, you get defensiveness when you critique these leaders, right? I think then just moving on to the government case about how their political legacies influence policies making for a significant amount of time. 5 main things. And firstly is the premise is simple, right? What these people support in terms of policies become easy way of garnering political support in the future. This looks like saying that, for instance, like Gandhi would have wanted that, or that Lee Kuan Yew would have supported this policy, etc. Right? Secondly, because these people are so influential, the proverbial shadow they cast and the specters they form haunt the political process, right? That means that you can actually get meaningful political discourse, and you need to recognize that meaningful political discourse is the way that you actually get social progress. Therefore, that's why oftentimes social progress have been halted in a lot of these countries within society, within Asia, right? Especially political process, right? This is problematic for several reasons. That this prevents the organic development and fading away of outdated political ideology, like Singapore's a liberal democracy, or Vietnam's central economy, or Gandhi's Hindu India, right? These years are probably no longer fitted to the modern context that exists, right? It glorifies these people and prevent meaningful and critical discourse on the nature of their action and the problematic nature of these leaders, right? Example, like Gandhi's scandals of indecency with his nieces, right? It becomes an easy basis of gaining political capital from the masses in the form of supporting the same policies they did, or targeting the same democratic that they did, therefore creating inequalities within society, right? Fourthly, then, what are the active harms of these outcomes, right? Firstly, then, is voter suppression and censure laws in Singapore is an unaccepted norm for the most part, right? People never try to talk about it otherwise, and it's very easy to enforce, right? Therefore, you don't get a lot of political discourse, and you don't get a lot of democratic choices within Singapore, right? The contribution of Muslim efforts in the Indian independence movement is largely ignored. For example, the Jinnah is marginalized, the Muslims are treated as fringe group, and opens up ground to continue their oppression and the lack of representation, right? Therefore, under side opposition, minorities are actually actively being harmed, and minorities are the one that these governments should actively actually protect, right? Thirdly, then, it looks like Vietnam non-democratic government has no incentive to cater to their ethnic minorities because power is unchallenged overall, and they can do whatever they want, right? Lastly, then on the larger argument, right? What would the counterfactual look like, right? Note that this is important because this is the comparative that exists in the debate, right? We think in a world where they weren't glorified, their policy choices will either die with them or be evaluated fairly, right? We think the claims of supporting these individuals wouldn't give rise to populist rhetorics. How this works is in the status quo, the common populist push is to say, we are the party of X and therefore we'll bring back the glory days, right? This works because those glory days are an association of both the leader as well as the nostalgic light by which we view them. In our counterfactual, we disassociate these leaders with the time frame where this happens, so populists can still say, we will bring back the glory days, but that signaling association is much weaker, right? More importantly, other parties can claim the same thing, that further weaken this populist push. We think in general, holding the government to account would have been much more readily done because these individuals don't wield as much power within their country compared to the status quo, right? For example, under India's INC, which has a lot of significant power over the country as a whole. This also means INC may lose support in some area. Note that this is a tipping point because where they may now lose local election in some state, there is less corruption too. But before that, are there any POIs? 3, 2, 1. No. Okay. In many cases, there would have been better minority representation than in status quo as well. The overwhelming of majority of voter support they can count on is probably mitigated as well. There is a greater focus on policies that work, the flaws of existing policy versus pure focus on character and less ability to dissent from this, right? I think it's harder for you as an individual to dissent someone's character versus actually dissenting against their policy because you can actually critically critique someone else's policies, right? Therefore, then moving on to the second argument, right? The trade-off versus unity, and this note that this is preemption to the opposition argument, right? If Op tried to argue that this is necessary to get unity in a divided nation so that policies can get passed, some preemption, right? Two main things then. Firstly, historically, nations had incentive to get basic infrastructure, economic development, constitutions in place when forming nations post-colonialism, right? There is an incentive to compromise because you want to show colonialists we can be successful when forming the nation, right? You want economic development anyways as you want to ensure basic functioning. People try not to devolve into partisanship at the beginning as people get disheartened when policies not to get passed and risk devolving either into chaos or violence, right? Therefore, this gives rise to these the rhetorics of these benevolent leaders, right? Because you try to actually develop post-colonialism, right? But today there is little need to have such leaders, right? Because there just means there is a lot less democratic accountability, right? That's why we regret it, right? Therefore, even if these leaders helped out originally, we have done more harm. That's why the motion should stand.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful speech. Now to oppose the case of Gov bench, let's have LO. You're here.
Can you give us like 1 minute to set up our connection again?
Am I audible and visible?
Can you try speaking again?
Am I audible?
I think it's soft. I think you have to move closer to the mic.
That's good. Really sorry for the technical issues. Is better?
I think that's better. I think just speak louder. So yeah.
Alright, I'll speak louder during the debate stuff. Begin my speech. Oh, I prefer my POI through chat. No preferred gender pronouns. I begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I would like to make it clear when it comes to benevolent strongman, it's not really like a normal strongman that you will look at like Xi Jinping or like Lukashenko and all that, where they actually like use a lot of things to actually harm the country itself, right? I'm going to point to you when it comes to like this strongman, there are two things you have to know. Number one, they're probably not going to be corrupt, and number two, they're probably not going to rule with a very iron fist, because that's literally not benevolent. And the question becomes, what exactly this benevolent strongman looks like? Firstly, it probably looks like they are the national icon because like they have done a lot of things and they have a lot of like grassroots support. So for example, like the Dr. Mahathir or like Gandhi or like the Lee Kuan Yew, where they have a lot of like grassroots support to actually gain the rise to become like the strongman itself. Secondly, they rise to power through democracy. That is to say that they actually have the confidence of the people to actually get into this power in the first place. The third thing is that a lot of time they have the policy that actually ensure that they have the legitimacy. So for example, Dr. Mahathir actually spent a lot of the budget to actually like improve the economy and the development of the country, of Malaysia itself, simply because of the fact that he wants to actually stay in power. But also the fact that like people are actually reaping a lot of that benefit because of his economic development to actually like that's why they allow them to actually stay within the power itself. Why this characterization is important then? Because if they want to argue the fact that, oh, a lot of like the policy is actually like not really that good or like it's very outdated, I think I'm going to point out is that a lot of like all of this benefit is actually good because of the fact that it do actually develop all of this country itself, which means create a better development for the country. But the second thing itself is the standard that exists because of like these benevolent leaders itself. That is to say that when you have a leader who actually able to actually improve the country itself, means that all those people will actually put a huge standard on the next leader who becomes the leader. That is to say, they probably look at the other policy that they're going to make in the future. Are they going to develop this country into the same level of like, or even better? There's continuously standard and there's continuous like check and there's standard that are actually going to be imposed. I'm going to characterize what exactly Asia looks like, because I think that they're a bit confused in terms of like how exactly, like they're saying that, oh, there will be like corruption, there will be a lot of like political power that are going to be state. Number one, I'm going to point out yourself that political party exists on both sides, and it doesn't exist simply because of the fact that benevolent dictatorship, right? For example, Malaysia have UNO, or like Singapore have their own party, and all like INC exists simply because of the fact that exists in the first place, right? All of those parties still exist on their side of the house simply because of the fact they already exist for so long, right? But the key things to know here is that a lot of time the benevolent strongmen, the first thing that they usually do is to actually like criticize the institution itself. Why? Because the institution itself is already been corrupted and always like abuse the country itself. This is why they have some kind of incentive to actually like fix the country, try to fix and try to go against this. We see this happen when Lee Kuan Yew literally go against the incumbent parties. We see that happen when and try to criticize the person in charge and try to mix garner a lot of like support. We see this happen when Dr. Mahathir garnered a lot of support by criticizing UMNO for like all of his the years of like try to actually exploiting and also use all this benefit or try to like exploit and try to benefit themselves. So we think it's important. The third thing I'm going to characterize is about Asia, right? Which is that Asia has actually been divided through imperialism, through identity politics, and through corruption. Now the question becomes, how do I actually unite these countries itself? Because this is a retrospective debate. That is to say that Asia need the leader that can actually unify them and try to actually call out all the injustice and put the interest of like the citizens over anything else. I think it's very important because Gov has to defend like an infant or like the instant democracy after like the inception of like the country itself, where like the people are not united and all of that things, right? I think it's very important. With that said, there are two pieces of argument. The first thing I'm going to argue, why exactly then the Asia need and a benevolent strongman? But before that, I'll take a POI.
Look, note that if you say identity politics is going to be bad, it's going to be worse off on side opposition. The minute that these leaders can use identity politics to associate with certain groups of ethnicity, especially when Asia is divided.
Okay, first of all, that's not mutually exclusive. It literally can happen on your side of the house simply because of the fact that they can still say that I'm just a party of this party, or like I'm already using like the political dynasty that already exists on both sides of the house. Right? The second thing, note as well, a lot of like this political party that like those strong men becomes a strong strong in power in the first place, simply because of the fact that they do go against those institutions or go against those political parties, which is how they're able to get a lot of power. I'm unsure why exactly that is actually a mutually exclusive benefits on your side of the house. First argument, why Asia need benevolent strongmen? I'd like to point out because of Asia is very conflicted and Asia has a lot of issues that are corrupted. Why? Number one, it's because of the divide and conquer that has been left by their colonizer, where a lot of people are actually not united, where a lot of people actually hate each other back then, right? This is retrospective debate. Secondly, there are literally weak democracy or try to backsliding, because that means that a lot of people can actually be corrupted. A lot of people can actually abuse their power, and we see this happen because a lot of political party stays in power because of they are corrupted. Third thing is there are the emerging market. That's to say that they are trying to develop, but they're not able to actually develop their country simply because of the fact that they don't have the ability to actually develop. The conclusion to this is that both sides will actually have the same problem in terms of the unity, in terms of the corruption, in terms of why exactly they have a very weak market in the first place. The question becomes, how do we actually solve this? I'm going to talk about the harms on government side. The first thing is that there will be a lot of distrust between people, simply because of the fact that you don't have a strong man that can actually unite a lot of people, right? Lee Kuan Yew literally able to unite all the races within Singapore to actually make sure that they are able to come together and work as together. Dr. Mahathir literally able to unite all the countries, the east and the west version, the east and west of Malaysia, to actually come together and to become one country itself under the national of Malaysia itself, right? Which is very important for them to actually it creates. We need this impetus of the nationality. But secondly, it gives the rise to the identity politics. The fact is, when you're not able to actually unify those people, it means that you are actually not able to. You will create a lot more identity politics simply because of the fact that people feels I'm different to you. They use the us versus them mentality and try to actually harm other people as well. It happens even more on their side of the house because they don't have anyone to actually control it. Thirdly, it's because the fact that they become their economy will become very weak, means that a lot of people can actually not able to develop their country itself. And I think it's very important because if you are not able to actually develop the country itself, it's going to be very harmful itself. I think that at that point, the comparative is far better on our side of the house, because glorification of it means that you push the idea that people have to become the standard itself need to reach the same level of these people. You need to reach you need to put your interest over. You need to put the interest of your citizens over themselves, which is far better. Why then the second argument? Why then weak leaders are far more harmful? Number one, it's because that they're less likely to actually prioritize their citizens itself, but they're more likely to prioritize about their own benefits. And we think that's very harmful when you don't have any kind of glorification because you don't put any standard. We see this happen when nobody actually nobody put Najib into a certain standard simply because of the fact that people feel oh, Najib is really people just look at Najib and don't put any kind of standard whatsoever, which allows him to actually try to exploit the country itself. But secondly, it makes them very hard for you to actually go against. It makes you harder for you to actually develop country because you don't have enough power whatsoever, which is far worse on the other side of the house. For those reasons, oppose.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful speech. Now to present the extension coming from GovBench, let's have DPM. Here.
Great. Can I confirm I'm audible and visible?
Yep, audible and visible.
Okay. POIs verbally. I repeat again, I take POIs by voice. Okay, cool. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What is the characterization of this leader? Firstly, the reason you are incentivized to portray them as benevolent locally is by trying to do things like say, we give you economic benefits in return for taking away some of your freedom. We give you a lot of these sorts of stuff, that help develop your economy. And in return, you ensure that you are, perhaps allow for some amount of censure in your economy. Notice the reason this makes sense with regards to Xi Jinping. There clearly are much worse dictators who aren't seen as benevolent. You're obviously Kim Jong-un is the worst example, but also things like Idi Amin, people like Mugabe and that sort of stuff. So I think the point is there is an incentive for Xi Jinping to be portrayed locally as a benevolent leader. Secondly, on the idea is, I think they are in many instances actively corrupt, right? Lee Kuan Yew literally has censure laws and has the inability to ensure meaningful opposition parties can come to power. But thirdly, even if they are good leaders, they often are used as martyrs on behalf of bad governments and political parties historically, which means that it ensures that the way nations develop, because it's a THR motion, is in ways that it actually cements the position of a political power as the founding party, because now the person they associate themselves with is a benevolent strongman. But fourthly, the incentive to fix the leader is quite unlikely, right? Look, you can critique issues on both sides of the house, but the ability stops when it goes wrong. Note the comparative. The leader may still exist on both worlds, which means some of the benefits we still get on our side, right? For example, you still get the capacity for Lee Kuan Yew to be able to a reasonable extent, unite these people. Notice they also never dealt in response with our preemption on why unity is not a tipping point, because you still have incentives to be unity, to unify anyway. They just counter-argue, right? The problem or the harm occurs will risk making these sorts of nations particularly bad, right? Okay. The next thing to then say, which is just puts a huge standard in future leaders. Firstly, this is symmetric if you like the leaders one's policies as opposed to the leader one's character. This is what is important about glorification. You inherently try and override the logical analysis of what is involved in policies. You instead try and ensure you exaggerate the capacity of that individual to be a benevolent person, the extent to which that person has good character and traits, it relates to the people and that sort of stuff. The implication is on their side, they focus on policies a lot less when they're deciding what a good leader looks like, which means the ability for future leaders to not actually make good policies, but just put propaganda and say, I am part of the same party that this specific leader was from. And thirdly, when especially the previous leader actively endorses them when they're still living, in those instances, the future leader gets a lot less accountability to begin with. But secondly, it means that when the future leader fails or is seen to be failed, regardless of having good policies, that also is very likely to happen because they aren't seen as members of the opposition party to begin with. Look, political parties may exist on both sides, but the ability to critique is different, and they preemptively become more corrupt as they believe they have agreed incentive, they have agreed capacity to do so, which means they historically do far more like worse sorts of or extreme sorts of policies to begin with. Let's deal with their case. They speak about Asia needing unity. They assert that Lee Kuan Yew is able to get a lot of people on their side. We can counter assert there are many other examples, like Gandhi, who's from Hindu majorities, Rahul Gandhi, who explicitly demonizes, doesn't love specific forms of minorities, and obviously Xi Jinping. So what we're going to give you is mechanisms. Why is the leader likely to come from majority? Often, the leader is likely to be an elite, which someone who's already privileged and thereby is someone who represents people from that nation to begin with. Two, the way you get buy-in into being a benevolent strongman is by preemptively saying, I'm a member of that specific majority, and at least being someone who the majority of people feel that they can relate to. Thirdly, this is often the reason as to how they're able to preemptively become more corrupt. Right? I know this is about Asia, but for example, Jacob Zuma comes to power with regards to the ANC or Robert Mugabe by saying they're members of that specific majority and they're going to represent the values of that majority to begin with. What does this mean? This means it is on their side, as we flip this material, they tend to use policies that tend to disproportionately harm minorities most of the time. Sure, Lee Kuan Yew is maybe an exception, but the point is on their side, they get to do things like, and maybe it's not actively oppressed, but it's things like, and not allow them from participating in government in the same way, not actively involve their icons within the process of actually creating this specific nation. But secondly, they tend to preemptively use all the love they have to ensure that the policies are passed are more extreme because they view themselves as a benevolent strongman leader who is election proof, who's able to ensure that they are not going to lose support of the people, which means they preemptively do things that are more extreme. This is what Xi Jinping does when he thinks that he now has the capacity to ensure he can do things like more aggressive military measures. This is what it looks like when you talk about these other sorts of leaders to begin with. The tipping point is not the incentive of the actor, it's the capacity for them to be effective because people believe them a lot more. Let's take POI from them. Yes.
Yeah, in your point of view, does the benevolent come from the leader's perspective or the supporter's perspective?
No. The point is it's both, right? So it comes from the supporter's perspective, but the point is that the leader is able to construct what a benevolent dictator looks like by saying, I give you economic rights in return for these sorts of things. So they're able to affect the way the people themselves view that specific leader, and they themselves think that I am a leader who now has censure-like proof or capacity to affect the system, which means I can put forth more extreme policies because I know people will not hold me accountable. You don't do that if you don't think you are a preemptively good leader. They never dealt with that counterfactual, by the way, which I'll get to in a little bit, right? Okay, so it means that they preemptively become more extreme, right? With regards to Xi Jinping making more aggressive international rules, weakens the already limited accountability in the system by ensuring he's surrounded by yes men. They feel they cannot do this if they think they are a leader who has greater capacity to be critiqued. That's what's so unique about glorifying this leader. That's why Op never misses out, right? It's about glorifying that specific kind of leader to begin with. But thirdly, right, historically, nations had incentives to get basic infrastructure, economic development, constitutions in place when they are forming nations post-colonialism. They never actually deal with this, right? So there is an incentive to compromise in the face of these massive ethnic tensions because you want to show colonials you can be successful, because minority parties still want economic development and the nation wants to ensure basic functioning. And people often try not to devolve into partisanship at the beginning anyways. But secondly, they make this a lot worse when it is majoritarian members who are the people who tend to be glorified, as is likely to be the case. We're giving you MEX for this. The implication being minorities get far more frustrated on their side of the house because they feel they are not being represented, but people always are glorifying and are loving this leader despite the fact they are not being particularly perfect. On our side of the house, the capacity for their criticism to be heard is likelier. The capacity for the criticism to be effective is likely because you don't have a cult of personality and on these specific sorts of leaders to begin with. But secondly, I think it just means that, okay, so let's then talk about our specific, about this part of the political party, right? The point is, this is historically oriented. So it's not just about political party, it's about what happens in many instances at the founding of that nation. Political dynasties develop over time when you argue that you get the benevolent strongman in the beginning, and you're able to argue that the future the benefits of the party is hinged on these specific leaders to begin with. That narrative is a lot harder to run. What was the counterfactual? Because they never actually engaged with this, they just counter-argued, right? And I think they're going to lose if they don't actually engage with it. The counterfactual is one where they often are less likely to be glorified, and their policy choices will either be evaluated a lot fairer. It means that they get far better forms of minority representation because the overwhelming majority of support is something that is mitigated for by the point where they can critique them. It often means that you can hold the government to account a lot better. But even if there's no difference, say, if this is not about democracies, you at least think that the ability for them to enforce it is a lot harder. If people think that it is not normal for Singapore to have bad voter suppression laws or censure laws, they will preemptively ensure they're all posting on social media, and the ability to enforce hundreds of thousands of people as opposed to a few hundred people is a lot more difficult. So the way the norm changes is different. The way the society changes is a lot more different. That is the nuance they dealt with. They can't just attempt to symmetrize, they can't strawman. We told you a bunch of unique benefits that are small and nuanced that ensure we get far better forms of democratic change. We're very happy to propose.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful speech. Now to extend the case of Op, let's have Yellow. Here.
Sorry for that. We have connection problems. Am I audible?
Yep, but I think it's also soft, so try to speak louder.
Sorry, what was that?
The voice is quite soft, so try to speak louder.
Okay, I will. No Chinese person believes that Mao Zedong is a benevolent leader. Chairman Mao literally killed his own people in order to stay in power. I don't know what world you live in, but that's not what benevolence means. Benevolence doesn't mean all-out dictatorship and literally destroying your own country in order to consolidate power. It means trade-offs. It means maybe you get some corruption here and there, but you prioritize things like economic growth. You do economic policies and prioritize your own people's interests over others. Our government pushes an unfair burden for me to defend freaking Saddam Hussein. I'm not going to do that, right? I'll give you some rebuttals and two bigger picture claims. On number one, how exactly do these people get power and confidence? And secondly, why the comparative of weak leaders are bad, and actually deal with the context, and I'll do some weighing later. First response is just to note that they are being incredibly uncharitable. They can't possibly expect us to defend literal dictators. But even if they do want us to defend this burden, they haven't proven to us why killing their own individual people on the ground means that that is benevolence. They haven't given us standards as to what benevolence looks like. We were more charitable and we gave you the nuance as to how benevolence probably looks like economic policies. It probably looks like having more confidence on the ground where people actually voted for you and you actually stayed for a longer period of time. Maybe there's some propaganda here and there, but it doesn't mean you commit genocide on your own people. That's absurd. But secondly, you have been super convenient.
POI.
POI is in the chat. You read the motion and then you took away the only example in the motion that actually is a benevolent leader, which is Lee Kuan Yew, who actually cared about minority support, who is actually a national icon. This is literally an unfair burden. We are going to be charitable, but just to note, they're not debating the debate. Second response, they're saying that people will go back to their glory days, and this is an inherent harm because it harms discourse. Just to note that discourse is inherently very speculative. Discourse is subjective. People will talk on both sides of the house. Media organizations exist on both sides of the house. But secondly, economic growth and prioritizing these good policies are obviously comparatively better because it's more urgent, right? So even if we agree that the benefit is discourse, number one, it's unsure what is the mechanization to change policies because discourse is incredibly subjective and speculative. But secondly, it is inherently deprioritized, and other things in this debate ought to be more prioritized because discourse is in the future and is incredibly long term. We need to care about people now. Now, their argument is discourse because then it will harm things like glory days, right? Firstly, both countries can use the same rhetoric. Both countries in India can be like, both parties in India, or all opposition parties can say, oh, let's go back to the days of Mahatma Gandhi when we fought for things like good values such as independence and actually going against foreign interests and correcting things like divide and conquer. These rhetorics can exist on both sides of the house. It's not exclusive. But secondly, these references to the glory days can also be good, which is why we flip the argument on being on comparison, right? When Tun Dr. Mahathir was an individual that pushed for more foreign direct investment into the country. They had Japanese investors coming into the country and creating Aeon. He nationalized the car. He did all these great things where people and individuals on the ground and minorities also know, which means that current Malaysian politics can also reference those days when these individuals had the empowerment in those times on opposition side exclusively. But secondly, if you want to pin your case on just connections to glory days and this nostalgic idea of what independence looked like, this is not exclusive because you are against independence. You're against traditional parties. This nostalgia will exist with or without glorification because old people will still always think and look back, well, oh, those were the days when things were much better, when when economic growth was comparatively better. Your case is value neutral at best. The comparative then, what do you say? You say that policies will die with them. Okay, you haven't proven why this is true because people will still remember the great things, especially your prime minister's opening line literally says that these policies are still heard of and used up to this day. So on comparative, these things are still going to be talked about on our side of the house, but it's untrue but secondly, why is it good that these policies die with them? Why is it good and the reason why is people forget all of the great things that these individuals did. People forget, which lends to more backsliding. Because Mahathir clamped down on corruption during his time, or Lee Kuan Yew clamped down on corruption or cared about minorities, if we forget about those things, then it lends to more things like identity politics. It means that people are not going to remember those instances when Lee Kuan Yew said that Singapore is Singapore for all and not only for Chinese individuals or Malays or Indian people. These are things, they're standards. They're obviously important and we should never forget them. This is a comparative win because we, at least, if the metric of this debate is discourse, we give more discourse because we compare it, that's more fruitful. Before I'm moving on, I'll take a POI. Yes.
What is the incentive for a benevolent leader to put forth a good economic policy versus an imperfect economic policy that will not be critiqued well?
So how do they get power and confidence? Two things. Number one is that they're willing to call out and compromise. Mahathir calls out UMNO all the time for being incredibly identity politics. Why do they do this? The reason why is if their own party is really corrupt, people can see. People can see that economy is stagnating. People can see that foreign interests are prioritized as opposed to local interests. If this does happen, then Mahathir or this Lee Kuan Yew will lose legitimacy. This is an incentive for you to not to continue to call out corruption within your own party. Secondly, more often than not, there are national heroes because of the public policy. This is where you make people look at these policies and say, well, that's a good policy. And because of that policy, now I have employment and now I have opportunities and transport. and direct investment, all those things. This means that once you pass these policies, and the reason why they have this incentive is because if you don't have this incentive, then you lose a lot of legitimacy to stay in power. There is a comparative benefit on our side of the house. What is the trade-off? Fine, sure, sometimes they're corrupt, but the trickle-down benefit still exists because that's bipartisan support here, because people have confidence in your policy, you have confidence in this government, and this is comparatively better for unification. If this debate was at the independent state of Singapore, we gave more reasons as to how we get much more unity and much more unification, the point in which when these individuals can collectivize literal races that have been harmed and suffered because of divide and conquer, that is good for nation building. We allowed Singapore to be what it is today. Second, last thing I want to say here is just on the weak leaders, right? Asia, on both sides of the house, there will be divide and conquer, there will be a lack of regulation, there will be political dynasties. But government has to defend a strong man bred out of those political dynasties. They have to defend a leader that is corrupt, because you have to defend a weak leader that is unable to call out their own party. For all those reasons, we are the only team that is more charitable. We take this debate. Thanks.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful speech. Now to summarize the case of Gov, let's have government left. You're here.
Am I visible and audible?
Yep, visible and audible.
Cool. Let me just set up my timer. In the meanwhile, I like my POIs strictly through chat. I'll take one around the 4th or 5th minute. I promise you I'll take one, so you don't really need to ask. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Sometimes the best indication of when a team has lost a debate is when they put words in our mouth that we literally didn't bring up and then claim that they are that we are strawmanning their case. What do I mean by this? The example for benevolent leaders was never Mao Zedong, it was Deng Xiaoping. You need to listen better. But our entire case was on the best case of op, right? We're talking about the Lee Kuan Yews, the Mahatma Gandhis, all the other like good examples I want to talk about. You need to engage with the best version of our frame and not just strawman a random case we never brought up. But the second thing I want to note is they've missed the point of a disaster gets motion. The counterfactual on government isn't benevolent leaders don't exist. This argument on unity is kind of useless, by the way, but about the consequences of what happens after that benevolent leader escapes from power, like, ends their reign in power. So the consequence has to engage with the word after what the benevolent leader has left behind. The debate isn't Lee Kuan Yew doesn't exist on our side or Gandhi doesn't exist on our side, but what are the consequences of their political legacies at the point at which you glorify them? Note that opposition doesn't really talk about that glorification. They just want to lie about the stuff we said or didn't say. So let's engage with the entirety of opposition, right? And I want to engage on 3 frames: unity, economy, and glorification. First, but before that, on like the analysis on discourse is speculative, because I think that's a really weak response. The first response to that is untrue. In countries like Singapore, you can literally go to jail for dissenting, right? Like Sheng Wu Li, who is probably somewhat famous in debating circles, has a standing warrant to be sent to prison for a private Facebook post he made criticizing the current Singaporean government. That's the state of discourse in a lot of these countries. So that means then is if we allow discourse to exist at all, it has to be better than the current echo chamber of political dominance that like the Singaporean government has right now. The reason why they can have that dominance is because Lee Kuan Yew's legacy policy of trading economic development for personal freedoms still stands, even though it's become anachronistic. That was the analysis from Pranav. If you don't hear that, you need to look at your notes and not just straw man about things we didn't say, right? What is the MEC to change policy is the other thing they asked. We said we break policy echo chambers. That's a big deal if most of these countries can't really get policies across in the first place, right? If the glorification of benevolent leaders doesn't happen to the same degree, the strength of their legacy policies become weaker, right? It doesn't just mean that they die away. In some cases, they still exist, but they become evaluated more fairly on the basis of the utilitarian strength of that policy, as opposed to the character of that benevolent leader. Once again, this is something both Audrey and Pranav extensively talked about. Opposition can't strawman us and say we said random shit we didn't. The final thing then is representation in legislation within that. What I mean by this is if you can have more of this discourse and get more of the votes out for these issues, it probably means then that we can get better representation and just break that echo chamber even further than just social discourse, right? That's the worth of discourse, because we have more voices and more policies that are being evaluated on a fairer metric when that overwhelming legacy of that policy is taken away at government. Right then. The second thing then within Unity was populist voices, right? They said, hey, references can be good and everybody can say that. But there's a nuance and a spectrum here because we were very clear. We said at the point at which these populist leaders make the appeal based on the character as opposed to the policy, the populist push to get votes is easier or not. Yes, both sides can say that, but on government, the way we evaluate those claims is based on the strength of the policy and not the strength of the character of the person who was pushing that policy, right? That's a crucial distinction. Note this is engaging with the best version of their case. Then why will policies die, right? On the economy. They say that you get backsliding and these policies are probably good. The point from government was never these policies are always a priori bad, but even if they are good policies, they can oftentimes be both imperfect and over time become outdated, right? That's the analysis both from Audrey and Pranav that we didn't really hear responsibly under straw man. But I'm going to deal with the best version of that straw man anyway, because the first thing is better policies get more airtime on government when we don't have the overwhelming weight of that legacy. But the second is because it's imperfect, the fact that they still exist today oftentimes leads to direct harms. Note the analysis on Singapore, for instance. But the third thing is it makes populist pushes worse when you can keep pushing that imperfect policy and not really deal with the realities of the things on the ground. But the fourth thing is we finally get to evaluate these legacy policies on a more fairer basis because we evaluate them on the strength of the policy utility as opposed to the personal characteristics of that policy. Right then, the third thing then on glorification and unity, they say we need power and confidence, and the only way we get that is because benevolent strong leaders can call out and compromise. Note this misses the point of a disastrous motion in the first place, right? This thing has already happened. This debate isn't about we delete like Lee Kuan Yew from existence or we delete Gandhi from existence. That's kind of absurd. The debate is they do all of these things already. Their legacy policies are what we need to evaluate, right? So they miss that comparative. But even if we like capitulate to that particular understanding of the motion, we say very, very clearly that there is a proper counterfactual on government where like these nations have an incentive to like collectivize and coalesce, right? Pranav's analysis specifically told you why we want economic development, why we don't want backsliding, because it's just objectively bad for people. But the third thing then is the illustration of this, because Japan, by the way, did the exact same thing and they're quite fucking successful right now. South Korea did most of the same thing, right? They work, even though they don't have benevolent strongman leaders. Opposition can't just strongman. This will never happen. We know this is true because these things literally exist in the status quo. Yes, Op, your point.
You genuinely think that Singapore will no longer be corrupt when you suddenly stop glorifying Lee Kuan Yew?
There's a distinction here, right? Because it isn't about stopping corruption entirely, but we're saying that the likelihood of corruption happening becomes weaker at the point at which the dominant political party isn't like a priori going to win the election every single fucking time. They have incentives to be less corrupt to garner more votes, right? But also we can see differences between words and actions better on our side because the actions aren't hidden by the nostalgic tinge like of that political legacy. So if the People's Action Party can say, hey, we're going to do the XYZ things because Lee Kuan Yew did them, the way we evaluate that as the general public isn't just, hey, the character of this person is good, so we must trust them. But what they say doesn't match with the policy, guys, because I can't speak out without being sent to prison, right? We think that's a very obvious cognitive dissonance that people are likely to recognize on government when we remove the nostalgic lens through which we view these political legacies. So then, the three frames they wanted to engage on, unity, we point out they've missed out regrets, right? But even if they don't miss that out, there's a clear counterfactual they've never engaged with, which solves most of those harms. On the economy, we've told you, policy evaluations need to be based on the merit of that policy. We do that better when we have more policies being discussed and existing policies being discussed on a fair basis. Finally, on glorification, they've never touched it. We've told you how it makes populism much, much worse on their end and how it just instills things like political dynasties that have no incentive to cater to like solving corruption and these sort of things. On all of these things, note that government's case, opposition hasn't really addressed us. Propose.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful speech. Now to summarize the case of Op, let's have opposition whip. Here.
Cool. Am I audible?
Yep, you're perfectly audible.
Alright. Okay. POIs in the chat, preferably by the 5th minute. If I don't take one afterwards, then just turn on your cameras. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's just make this clear. government's first instance was that, number one, it's because of the glorification of benevolent leaders. This means that political discourse in general is diluted with the fact that the history of this particular benevolent leader is going to destroy every single political discourse. I.e., whenever you want to talk about, I don't know, any economical reforms, it's going to be, you know, at the instance of referring or citing the same Lee Kuan Yew's or the same Mahatma Gandhi's. But at the same time, when it comes to just like the comparative under their side, which means that they want to have more meaningful political discourse, somehow you're going to have a much better standard of saying that, okay, now you can scrutinize one party over the other, and then you're just going to take a look at the policies that this particular benevolent leader has. Number one, if the harms of political dissent means that you can be in jail, what does it mean to have your political discourse under your side? Does it mean that the criticizing leaders would mean we just say pros and cons? But even if it's going to be pros and cons, to a certain form of degree, when you basically talk shit about a certain political party, sure, you still might get like jail in the first instance. So I don't really get what is the picture of having meaningful political discourse. And by the way, this is their main principal argument about how this can be more amplified at the point where you don't glorify these individuals. The same glorification that exists under our side is one that is good, because you can say you can have the same amount of you can say have the same amount of political discourse at the cost of having that glorification as a standard to scrutinize the following leaders that you want to have in the future. Meaning, sure, like Lee Kuan Yew will be something in the past, but Singapore in the future will review side by side to the policies that can basically equate to the same greater degree of what Lee Kuan Yew proposed in Singapore in the first instance. Two issues I'd like to bring this to debate today. First and foremost, first issue is unifying trumps over the principle on government side. And number two, which side can get more political discourse? On the first issue, then, unifying trumps over principle on government side. First of all, we posit to you that Asia was in like ruins, right? It's because of how you have political discourse. This is because of two reasons. Number one, you have the lack of prioritization, in which leaders just often wouldn't focus on where to go first. Should you focus on the people first, or should you focus on like foreign policy first, right? But the second part here is just to have the lack of compromisation. The fact that we live in a post-colonial area where like literally there are basically a lot of like conflicts between races and religions, or even just different sects, means that in the parliamentary section, you have a difficulty of just compromising, because it's hard for you to get the message over across, right? And this happened back then, like during the times when like Lee Kuan Yew was just growing up, right? This means that like moving forward, benevolent leaders actually saves the country because of how they took a stand, because of how they're like most of the time anti-establishment, or even just like took a stand in which that, you know, they actively engage in just political dissent across the political opposition, right? Fast forward now, the rise here equates to standards. Three things I like to say in this point. Number one is just heavy scrutinization. This means that the form of political discourse that exists within society, in opposition side at least, is one that is meaningful, right? Because not only do you always cross-references a lot of the policies made by the benevolent leaders to make sure that the policies that exist right now can actually come across, but number two, it becomes like a social narrative to think that, hey, I think we need to do way better than this, or at least we need to be at the same form of like level to make sure that it can actually benefit people. Because what Lee Kuan Yew did to its own people actually give, in a way, like, you know, give benefits and basically just develop Singapore to the big country that they are right now, to the point where they are actually developed, right? Almost developed, right? This means that number two, like Prime Minister said that like people want to go back to the old days, right, on their side. If government concedes this means that there is some room for like political dissent. But even if it's so that people actually want to say that they want to go back to the olden days, like what is the actual harm there? Because the olden days oftentimes equates to the times when like, you know, the country is developing, the country is good, economy is rising, people are getting more jobs. So I think it's like a net benefit for people wanting to live the good old days, because they're comparing with the situations right now, it's actually bad for their own situations. Therefore, just by having unification at the cost of probably some form of political dissent, we win on this clash. But before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Look, side opposition has the burden to defend glorification, which is oftentimes not questioning the act of these leaders and the past atrocity. Oftentimes these leaders can put up a fake facade of whether or not they are good or bad, and that's what you have to defend on side opposition today.
Yeah, but like, what do you want us to defend though? That's like defending Xi Jinping, where no form of political dissent can happen. This happens on a debate where some form of like strongman, but it's still benevolent. So you have some leeway to have some political dissent. That is the debate we're going for. And yeah, sure, we can still have the same amount of like political discourse under my second issue, which is which side can basically produce more meaningful political discourse. The problems I have with under their side is that they posit to you that it's because of how you have this glorification. This means that people are most of the time sticking to the reality of the situation, where they oftentimes want to cite all of these old leaders where, like, you know, the current leaders just couldn't compete in the first instance, right? One problem I have with this is that they said that people glorify the character and not the policies. Let me just break it down to you. Like, this is just a meta way of response. Their MAC is actually contingent on people having discourse in the future, meaning, like, to a certain extent, people are actually going to glorify the party. For example, if Mahathir back then was a part of UMNO, then in the future, when people want to say they want to go back to the old glory days, they will cite UMNO instead. This means, to a certain extent, they don't really like glorify the character of the individual, but rather what did the party do to make sure that they basically compensate or even just contribute to the people in general, right? But number two, when Lee Kuan Yew actually died, like afterwards, Singapore became more like they had more democratization. Sure, people still talk about Lee Kuan Yew, but at least there is some form of political discourse where you can basically cite him, and at the same time won't have any much of a problem. But the third part here is to explain that the way people vote leaders, it's not by their characters, it's by what they're contributing, i.e. their policies. Character probably comes second when they see like, okay, this guy is a good figure because he's a good father, or like this lady has time to, you know, go to the parliament and still come back home to serve their kids, right? So in all instances, this fact that people glorify this character is one that is not even nuanced at all and not even true. The way here is pretty much simple. In times of distress in general, right, when we look at countries where like Asia, for example, who probably still struggle because of the long-term effects of colonialism, we say that unification actually trumps over this principle because of two things. Number one is just practically like urgency, right? It's because of how people are literally on the ground dying, and you need that form of like, you know, economic policies that can turn these developing nations into an emerging economy to make sure that they can probably survive for the next 10 years, right? But number two, you have literally lack of resources to basically prioritize the principle of trying to have good democratization, simply because of the fact that you're not probably that stable enough to have that form of political resource. With that being said, never been harder to oppose.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful speech. Now to proceed with the reply portion of this round, let's have opposition reply. Here.
Right. So they claim that we strawman them, and then they say that, oh, no, we don't have to defend Chairman Mao. But let's look at what are the characterizations of these benevolent benevolent leaders on that side of the house. They say, oh, these benevolent dictators force people to never question them. They use so much propaganda. They use Sedition Act every chance that they get. That looks to me that that is literally the definition of what Chairman Mao did and every other dictator, which means that they're unclear as to what exactly they are defending and they're pushing to us. This means two things. Number one, it pushes an incredibly unfair burden for us because we're not defending these horrible caricatures of these horrible leaders. But number two, this is just completely unrealistic for us to defend because people on the ground will always call these individuals out literally because they're freaking crazy people on both sides of the house. What does this mean then? What are the three crashes in this debate and how do we win them? Firstly, on discourse, right? They told us that people will always compare them to these glory days, and this is obviously a very bad thing. And for some reason, and then they say that, oh, on their side of the house, there'll be so much more focus on merit, right? I don't think you can fiat that like people will focus on merit on both sides, and how we gave a lot of legwork to prove why these economic policies are meritocratically correct and rationally sound, right? We gave you examples as to how these leaders direct a lot of foreign investment, which actually uplifted the quality of life of individuals on the ground. This also means that we also get, this also proves that we get the additional value of these individuals having, like minorities, having gone through their reigns, the reigns of Dr. Mahathir, the reigns of Lee Kuan Yew, and also constantly always going to bring that up. At any point there is a discourse, at any point there is a conversation about UMNO or a conversation about Singapore, they will always bring up the fact that like Lee Kuan Yew wouldn't do these things, that Mahathir wouldn't do these things. That is comparatively better because we at least get some form of discourse on our side of the house. Secondly, on accountability. This argument on accountability, if we take it at their best, it disregards the context. On both sides of the house, UMNO, BJP, and will always be corrupt. They will still have really, really like bad sedition policies. They're probably going to be corrupt anyway, right? But what is the comparative then? If you don't idolize Tun Mahathir, if you don't idolize Lee Kuan Yew, you idolize their parties on both sides of the house anyway. You idolize UMNO, you idolize Singaporean, you idolize these parties, these traditional parties on both sides of the house. This means that the impact, even if we believe it, is marginal because you cannot quantify what exactly is the difference between accountability through like strongman leaders and accountability through like actual accountability. It's unclear on that side of the house. But have they actually proven likelihood of accountability? Because they told us that the point in which when you don't glorify them, you forget all of these policies, right? We told you how we want to have people to remember these policies. We want people to remember the fact that these individuals called out these horrible economic policies. We want minorities to remember the fact that Mahathir fought for these minority communities. These are comparatively good things that also contribute to discourse. We think accountability can happen on our side of the house as well. But what then is the most important thing on this debate? It has to be unity. We're talking about an Asia that is post-colonial, I agree, and incredibly divided, where identity politics is rampant. We need now a national hero that can bring us all together, regardless of our differences. We have sufficiently demonstrated that these national benevolent leaders are the exact embodiments of those national heroes and icons, which means that they ought to be glorified, because once we glorify them, we make people remember that these are the standards of our country and we have to revert to them at any chance we get. For all those reasons, exceptionally proud to oppose.
All right, thanks so much for a wonderful speech. Now to formally conclude this exceptionally well debate, let's have government reply. Thank you.
Hello, can I confirm I'm audible and visible?
Yep, audible and visible.
Great. POIs were, no, fuck, what am I saying? Okay, this is a reply speech. Okay. Wow, it's been a long night. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's talk about unification. What they never responded to were the 3 reasons why unification is not the tipping point. Because in many instances, there is still symmetric incentives to want to ensure that you don't devolve into ethnic conflicts. In order to show colonialists you can be successful, you still want basic economic development, which is the precondition to ethnic concerns. And people try not to devolve into partisanship at the beginning because you tend to get disheartened when policies don't get passed and you risk devolving into chaos or violence. But the second response to this is the counterfactual still accesses all of these good benefits, because the point is they never explained why this specific narrative had to be the tipping point in ensuring that all of these sorts of benefits accrue. I posit that by virtue of putting forth a good economic policy, irregardless of whether you are viewed as a benevolent strongman leader, you are still able to get many groups of people to buy in because it is a good economic policy. Okay, let's talk about that actual thing on unification. Let's be a little bit more nuanced in data, right? So on unification, the thing is, right, I think in many instances, when you talk about different sects, right, so the examples aren't just of like, you know, Deng, aren't just of like the kinds of, like the single example of Singapore, which is very convenient. It's of Deng Xiaoping, it's of Jawaharlal Nehru, it's of Vietnam, who often in many instances actively engaged in bad policies. But crucially, unlike them who asserted their characterization, we actually gave you the mechanism for this because they often were members of the majority ethnic party, which means that they often have incentives to ensure that they tend to exclude these sorts of things. Their response in third op was, there is no incentive for these these policies to look bad because of fear backlash. One, the problem is the people do not need to make an absolutely horrible policy, just a fairly imperfect one, ensuring you don't enjoy massive backlash, but also a policy that actively supports the majority, doesn't face that kind of backlash anyways, and people would still like them. Secondly, you tend to focus more on the character of that individual in many instances, as opposed to linking it to that specific policy anyways. On our side of the house, the policy, the good economic policy symmetrically exists because unity is a tipping point, but the bad economic policies are ones you cannot critique a lot better. But thirdly, as we told you, the problem is people tend to actually make them a lot worse because they never dealt with our specific analysis on who this actor is likely to be. The weighing is quite simple, right? Okay, and I think the weighing is quite simple, right? One, we prioritize, let's say we have to accept this trade-off. We prioritize the future in the long term over the point at which you need unity for formation. They never weigh this. One, it is a longer period of time after the point of unification when you ensure that policies are in place. Two, it is impacting far many more people to begin with. And three, the future impacts of a nation extend well into the future beyond the present, which means always you'll be impacting more people when you have bad democratic policies as opposed to on their side of us when just the unification is something that symmetrically happens. So I don't think unification is quite the tipping point. What were our analysis? Their suggestion was that when we talk about our policies, right? So like these sorts of stuff. Firstly, you can often be the founding father of a specific nation and thereby get benefits without actually putting forth good economic policies. This is literally what people like Jawaharlal Nehru often did. This is what we gave the example in Audrey's speech of Jacob Zuma and that sort of stuff as well with regards to colonialism. But secondly, the counterfactual is you still often get the same good policies anyways, because it's unclear why Lee Kuan Yew cannot do this by this one alone. But what applies is when it is a bad policy to begin with. But the third thing to note is, right, this is actually a narrative debate. So this is about the ability to be believed, to be listened, for people to think that you are accurate, firstly. And secondly, there's the ability for you to preemptively think that because I get so much support, I can indulge in more extreme policies. I don't think they entirely engage with this in a more charitable way. The thing is, it's not just about bad dictators, right? When we talk about things like benevolence and that sort of stuff, it's about like Gandhi, it's about the benefits that you get from that. What do they say to this? Rhetoric. What they said was that old people will still think the past is good. But obviously, one, it's not true for young people. But secondly, I don't think it's true for old people, because at least in our side of the house, you can link the good old days to a specific policy proposal. But on their side of the house, they often have the incentive to link it towards the actual person, because the nature of glorification is such that you look and exaggerate beyond what is actually appropriate. But also, the second speech, you often link it to that specific character of a person. This is what the difference is, right? But you can't just idolize a party. You have to link it to the character of a specific person. But the ability to glorify presumes that the alternative will be effective in the absence of this. They never give you a counterfactual, and they never responded to ours, which is you can still get a lot of the positive benefits, and unity is in a tipping point, but in the negative instances, you get a lot of our benefits. Then our benefits weren't just about discourse. It was the ability to make discourse actually change things in terms of ensuring get better forms of accountability, especially within democracies that aren't entirely this. The response is, but with regards to jailing, this is problematic. But the problem is at the point, the censure is less likely to happen because opposition parties will call out Lee Kuan Yew a lot more. That is what happens when you don't have this narrative. That's why we're very happy to propose.
All right, thank you so much for that wonderful, engaging debate. Debaters, please cross the house, and for the observers, you may now leave us for us to deliberate our decision. So